and it's for data circuits, and we'll connect those data circuits through Kent streams. And funnily enough, I don't know for what reason, Bruce House was one of the few buildings that had a fiber connection at that time. So the idea behind it was, we said, let's look for a place that has fiber connection, because we don't know how much bandwidth we're going to all need to get into there. So we need something that is future-proof. And that's what drove the selection of Bruce House. So once he told us Bruce House was one of them, I think there was a couple of others, we then started talking to the management of those buildings to find out, is there space available? How much is it? And then, eventually we were able to negotiate a good price on the office that eventually was taken up. But it was driven by the presence and availability of fiber. That's what drove the choice. And it was actually so in a way it was Songa's, compendium of knowledge about data circuits that helped us make that choice. Yeah.
Actually, when the history of telecoms in Kenya will be written, Songa will need a chapter or so, because I remember there are times when he would be handling an issue, and then his shift would be over. Maybe he'd go out, and he would actually take the effort to go to, if he goes, let's say, to a pub, he would actually look for the nearest phone booth and give you that number and say, if you need me, call this number, and ask whoever is here to call me from inside this pub, and I'll come and sort you out. He was very helpful. That's interesting. Why you guys selected Bruce House. So at this time, internet is growing, customer numbers are growing exponentially. You guys are making some little headway in pushing for international bandwidth availability. So that is happening. But now a new problem comes in, that your last mile, which is copper based, which is also on what I would call legacy equipment at that time, is creaking under the weight of this high amount of traffic. So again, you guys are in problems, because now you have the international capacity, but you do not have the last mile. So at this time, it is when we started hearing about people talking about wireless connections, WiMAX. New players started coming into the space. Maybe you could give us a brief history of that time when the only way to connect to the internet was via a copper pair, which would do 64 kilobits per second max. And the reason why 64 is because the network that powered the voice system at that time could do a max of 64 kilobits per second. If you want to sample a voice signal in such a way that you do not lose a lot of quality of the voice. So you do 64. That's why we are stuck with 64. You could break it down to 32 to 16 to 8. What was happening at that time in the ISP space to try and agitate for the availability of more last mile connectivity solutions, either through your own private initiative in investment, because that was a new front now. Traditionally, last mile was being provided by incumbents in most countries at that time. And the ISPs doing infrastructure was something new. So could you maybe just give us a brief of that time?
Yeah, so you're very right about last mile beginning to become a big bottleneck, right? First and foremost, the copper plant was a finite resource.
Yes.
You had only a certain number of pairs that had been provided to a particular neighborhood. Once those pairs were finished, that's it. I'm sorry. It doesn't matter how much money you pay, unless you can negotiate with Telkom Kenya to lay another big multi-pair, and there will be pipes of 100 pair, 200 pair, whatever. Big pipe, big cable, right? and put up a distribution box which would terminate and then now drop from there to the individual residences or location, you are stuck, right? And a number of interesting things happened around that time. Before I talk about wireless, let me tell you about two things that were revolutionary, one of which was a little bit weird. In Kenya, what is this? Okay, in other countries, like especially in the US, there's something called a statute of, the amount of time after a crime has been committed before somebody can be prosecuted for it. Is it statute of limitations or something like that? I think that's what it's called. What is that in Kenya? Is it 10 years or 20 years or 7 years or something? I don't know. Or maybe Kenya doesn't have, but I'm going to confess to a crime right now. That's what I'll say. It's funny. So the two things that happened with the last mile, this is on copper, that were very interesting. One was something called pair gain technology, right? What pair gain technology did is pair gain allowed you to use one copper pair and multiplex it. So you were able to put a box on one end, connected to another box on the other end, and you'd be able to take that one pair and multiplex it into 2, 4, 6, 8, 10 outbound copper connections. And the boxes would be able to just do the logic in between. And that was kind of a precursor of ADSL, because the technology that the boxes used was ADSL technology, which we then later on used to be able to set up things called building nets. This is what made ISP Kenya so big and so successful so fast, because we were coming in late. 1999, already there were about 20 ISPs in the marketplace, and they had cornered all the residential, they had cornered most of the businesses. So as an upstart who was coming in late, we needed to have a special strategy that would give us traction quickly. And what we did is we picked on this technology, this ADSL technology, and we came up with a product called Building Net. So we were the first ISP to start putting a big pipe to a building, and then we just build another separate internal network distributing the internet over that pipe to the tenants in the building in a way that can be managed and in a way that can be, sort of handled independently. And it was all going over copper. Now that leads me to my second question and my big confession, where we broke the law, and I was partly responsible for that. Of course, the copper plant was running out. ISP Kenya was based in Westlands at Central House. Most of the customers connecting to us on leased lines were in Westlands, Parklands, of course, going down into town and so on. Kileleshwa, Kilimani, Riverside Drive. We had used, by the time we got to, I think, 2002, 2003, we had finished all the copper. There was no copper available anymore.
Wow.
For leased lines. It was over. And we kept on asking Telkom, it would take between 3 to 6 months on a particular route for Telkom to put in a new cable. So what did we do? We went and we talked to the regional team that was responsible for our area, and we built our own network illegally.
Oh, wow. On top of
we bought cable. We bought cable. It was running in Telkom conduits, everything. I mean, we had thousands of kilometers of copper. Wow. We built our own DBs, everything, and we were using the Telkom Kenya. Telkom Kenya guys, their office was somewhere uko Peponi Road, somewhere uko nyuma. Unbelievable. We had our own independent network. And actually, by the way, guys at that time were asking us, hey, but how is ISP Kenya continuing to grow? And there's no copper.
And exactly.
Yeah. And eventually we went into industrial area. We set up a POP in industrial area, and we did the same there. We went and we set up a POP in Mombasa. We did the same. So we had a shadow copper network
running on top of the Telkom network.
Very, very, very illegal. And only a few people in Telkom Kenya knew about it. And we couldn't even, if there was a problem, we couldn't really call the usual guys. We had to call only the guys who were on our payroll. Because we actually had some of the guys on our payroll who were running this shadow network. And that lasted for a couple of years. Then, of course, was superseded by wireless and all of that. Now, wireless issue affecting wireless was a regulation that existed at the time where CCK said you are free to use any wireless technology to connect any 2 points as long as you don't cross a public boundary. Public boundary being go outside of your plot. Huwezi toka plot yako. That was basically the layman's translation. So as long as you're inside your plot or your property, you can use a wireless connection. Public boundary in its simplest terms was defined as a road or a plot demarcation.
Okay.
So that was the regulation that stood at the time and governed wireless. So as Tesbook, we also took it upon ourselves to now try to negotiate, and after a series of lobbying with lobbying CCK, they were able to allow for use of the unlicensed, the ISM band across public boundaries. But they said you have to notify us. We have to be able to just, approve. We have to authorize, not authorize, but notification. So it wasn't granting of a license. It was just, you disclose the link and then we can update our records accordingly.
Okay.
And then that allowed, of course, the entry of things like the WiMAX, Briscom, some of those early wireless providers. Eventually, Mikrotik, became really big with their wireless stuff. Then Ubiquitys came along. The rest is history, really. But those were some of the challenges that were faced at the beginning.
Now, thank you for that. Now, as you guys continue to grow within the country, the same was happening in other African countries, and slowly it emerged that most of the problems that you are facing are the similar problems that maybe ISPs in a different country within Africa are facing. So all of a sudden now you guys have common problems. You have you need to speak in one voice. You need to have a lobby group that you can work with to agitate for change in the space. And African ISPs needed to come together. What would you say was your role in that, in the formation of the African ISP Association?
Okay, so that whole process happened in two sort of stages. First and foremost, when KXP was switched on in 2000, it worked for about a week before it was shut down by CCK. In a way, that was a blessing in disguise, because we then kicked up a huge fuss and for 1 year embarked on a massive lobby where we mobilized every single possible resource that we had at our disposal, both locally as well as internationally, to bring pressure on the government to open up KXP. It was shut down on the basis that it was operating illegally and it needed a license. However, before we set it up, we had been given every reassurance by CCK that no license was needed. Even the guy who flew in from Cisco had insisted that he needs to see from himself and hear for himself from the regulator that this is okay. And we actually took him. The first thing we did is we took him to meet CCK at their offices. And he verified that they have indeed said that this facility does not need a license. However, that time being the time that it was, the guys at Telkom Kenya didn't feel good about this thing. It was making them look bad, because up until then, there was actually something called the Kenya Internet Exchange, KIX,
Yes.
If you search on the internet, you might find some documentation that refers to it. I don't know if the archives go that far back. But Telkom Kenya, at the time that they were getting approvals to set up JamboNet, they had also been given funding for something called Kenya Internet Exchange. There are some consultants that had come in and advised them, and they had told them, you need to have JamboNet, which will be your international IP gateway. Then next to it, you need to have a Kenya Internet Exchange, which is a local facility that will exchange local traffic. The guys at Telkom Kenya had cooled the money for Kenya Internet Exchange. They had eaten the exchange point. So the fact that now ISPs are saying they need an internet exchange point was exposing, because questions now are being asked. Si kitu tulikuwa tumepeana pesa.
Yes.
Why are the guys now saying they need it? And yet we had removed money for this. Where is that money? Where is that thing? So some of the higher ups at Telkom Kenya went and told CCK, this is a threat to national security. Shut it down. And the only reason that CCK could find to shut it down was that it doesn't have a license.
Unlicensed. Okay.
And that's the reason and the premise on which it was shut down. So we then embarked on this huge lobby. We talked to everybody. We talked to NSIS, we talked to the CID, we talked to the military, we talked to MPs, we talked to ministers, we talked to CCK themselves behind closed doors. But in the public, we were making a lot of noise constantly. And we mobilized support. Almost all of the foreign missions in Kenya started making calls to high levels, calling the president, calling ministers. We even had at some point, I remember a statement coming out of the US Department of State, really criticizing the government for shutting down something so progressive. So eventually this became a very big embarrassment. You know, guys would go for international conferences and they'd be asked, why are you frustrating internet service providers in your country? What is wrong with you? Don't you understand that internet exchange points are the building blocks of the internet? Why would you do something like that? And they'll come back and say, what is this thing we are being told about KIXP? Ni kitu gani hiyo? Can somebody come and explain? And eventually it became clear that this thing was done in a very roughshod way. So CCK eventually came back to TESPOC and said, okay, guys, we will allow KIXP to operate, but you have to apply for a license. So KIXP became the first IXP in the world to have an internet license. Can you imagine?
Oh, wow.
Very, very, very weird set of circumstances. And it set a bad precedent because now that's the same copy, the same example that Uganda and the rest followed. So that's where I'm going with this story. So eventually now others took notice in the process of us making so much noise. And then eventually getting the exchange point opened again, it drew a lot of international attention. And there was a lot of celebration, of course, once it was reopened. So we were contacted actually by quite a number of different organizations asking us if we can help other countries with their process. And I remember getting an invitation by DFID, the UK's Department for International Development, to go and help Uganda with their process and to go and help Tanzania with their process. Then at the same time in that conversation, we said, look, why don't you, instead of, it's not very efficient for us to get one person or two people from Kenya to go to many different countries, right? Why don't you give us some funding so that we can organize an IXP event in Kenya and invite ISPs from other countries who can come and learn about this. So at the time, we organized something called an ISP forum. And I think about 70 ISPs, no, 40, at that time it was 40 ISPs from different countries were sponsored by the UK's DFID. And they came to Kenya. We met at the Safari Club, Kasarani. And, you know, discussed issues of internet exchange points, We had speakers come in and they were able to talk to them about the social aspects of setting up an exchange point, regulatory aspects, the social engineering, of course, getting people to set aside competitive concerns and collaborate. Then, of course, the technical training. And that was a huge success. And I remember that time we also asked Mikrotik. Mikrotik was just new. We called the CEO of Mikrotik to come, John Tully. And he came and he was one of the key resources, actually sharing how Mikrotik routers were an alternative to Cisco, because all of us at the time were Cisco.
Yeah.
And that gave them a huge entry point to begin selling their products in Africa. Then a few months later, if you remember, there used to be an event in Kenya called ITEC. The annual IT, whatever, organized by Sean Moroni. So there was a big annual event that they would have in South Africa. What was it called? I forget the name.
Was it Africa?
And it was once it was once a year, not the AfricaCom. It was an ITEC event, but it was continent-wide. They would target, like, bring people from all over the continent for this event, and it was always in South Africa. So he decided, hey guys, why don't we organize another, because he heard about what had happened with the ISP forum in Nairobi, the smaller one. And he said, why don't you guys come together and organize an ISP forum and have it run alongside, on the sidelines of the big IT thing in South Africa? So we reached out again to DFID, and they gave us some money again to now, open the net further. And we mobilized. This time, I think there were about 70 ISPs that were able to come, fully paid for. And we had this meeting that ran on the sidelines of ITEC, the ISP Forum, an African ISP Forum. And it was at that meeting, in the process of ISPA South Africa, which was the ISP Association of South Africa, and TESPOC, sharing their experiences and successes in being able to organize and lobby, that ISPs from different countries said, can you all come together and help us? Help us to come together and set up internet service provider associations in our countries. Help us to set up internet exchange points. And that's where the idea of setting up AFRISPA was formulated. The resolution to set it up, and all these 70, ISPs to be the sort of founding members. A quick MOU was drafted and signed on, and they all said, okay, Brian, can you be the first general manager? There's no money, there's no pay, but if you can be, willing to take on a voluntary basis, the role of sort of just running the day-to-day, organizing, bringing things together, looking for money, and then, sort of ensuring the implementation of different work plans. And that's how it started. And, less than, I think, 18 months later, we were able to apply for and successfully win a $1 million project funding of $1 million from something called CATIA, the CATIA program, catalyzing access to ICTs in Africa. So there was a component that AFRISPA was given responsibility to manage, and it was all about setting up internet exchange points and helping ISPs to set up ISP associations. So that funding funded 3 years of activities, where we saw about 12 internet exchange points established across different countries, and about 20 or 21 ISP associations established across 21 different countries. So that was the genesis of AFRISPA. And I must say that organization served a very huge part in terms of just being able to increase the awareness around internet exchange points. It's out of AFRISPA that the pitch to the African Union and the European Union for something called AFIX was initially put together. We put together the initial proposal or the concept paper behind AFIX, the African Internet Exchange, which was a vision to basically see inter-regional exchanges coming up, And eventually that got huge funding from the European Union. But by that time, AFRISPA wasn't able to deliver. It kind of crumbled and fell apart. So the work was given to the Internet Society. That's the work that Kina Michuki, Kevin Chege have been doing for the last almost 10 years. The Internet Exchange Point work that they've been doing. The initial funding that came from the European Union for that was on the back of a proposal that was put together by myself and my team at AFRISPA. So, it's incredibly exciting to really see, the impact and how big these things have grown, so many years down the line. Yeah.
Wow. And I think it's at the back of some of these things that you guys did in the early days that we saw an acceleration of technology. And at around the same time when all these internet exchanges were being set up, there was the advent of mobile technologies. When no one knew what a mobile phone was at that time, that technology started slowly being adopted in the country. And if I'm not wrong, you're one of the first people to venture into that space. But I'll let my co-host Mugambi do some further digging on that space as you transitioned from being a pure ISP guy, network infrastructure, into mobile and the services thereof. So there's a transition that we are seeing with you here, moving from setting up infrastructure and now to providing services. Karibu, Josh.
Yeah, that's right.
So policy, you've been doing policy, you've been building essentially the internet infrastructure. But at the heart of it, you used to sell grapes. So you're still an entrepreneur.
Hustler. Well, it's not very nice to use the term hustler nowadays, given the political climate. But yeah, trader.
So maybe you can take us back to why you lost why you left ISP Kenya without shares, and also how you started In Hand Kenya.
So when we were setting up, ISP Kenya, I was really naive, right? As far as business is concerned. Blame it on a lack of education, I guess, because, I'd been reading as much as I could. I never went to university, but I'd been reading everything I could about technology, but I'd not done as much reading about business as I ought to have by that time. So at the time we were setting it up, I was offered shares by the other 3 founders. We were 4 of us that started, right? Yazim Nanji, Sane Mangat, Hamish Govani. And they said, how much shares would you want? Can we just split 4 ways, or what, what is the whatever? And at that time I said, no, guys, I don't want to have shares. I was still carrying the pain from the breakup of my first company that I'd set up with 3 other guys, corporate computers. The company I'd set up in 93, which ended up failing when money started coming in. So I just was disillusioned, and I decided, hey guys, I'd rather just know that I have a certain amount of assured income, so that I can take care of the family, my young family at the time, mambo ya shares, let's see how this thing goes, then we can discuss later. Then I forgot completely about anything to do with the shares until, and this is the irony of this whole situation, at some point somewhere around 2004, Joseph Mushero and I actually it was 3 of us, 3 CTOs. So Joseph Mushero was the CTO at 190 Online, Robert Mugo was the CTO at UUNet, and there was myself, CTO at ISP Kenya. The 3 of us would meet every Friday afternoon at Railway Golf Club, and we'd play 9 holes of golf. And after that, we'd just sit and have a bite and a drink and chat. And, it was very nice. It was very relaxing. It was a time away from the office. It wasn't so far away from work that if there was an emergency, we couldn't get back quickly. And we just got into this pattern of doing this every Friday. Not all of us would make it all the time. Sometimes I couldn't make it. Then it was just Joseph and Robert. Sometimes Joseph couldn't make it. It was just Robert and myself. And sometimes it's Robert who could make it. And one of those times when Robert couldn't make it, we were just walking, hitting balls. And, I kind of said to Joe, I said, look, you guys are the biggest residential ISP in Kenya right now. 190 online, it goes without saying. Yeah. ISP Kenya, we are probably the leading corporate ISP if we go by the number of corporate customers that we have. We may not be the biggest in terms of revenue, but the number of corporates with our building net product, we've swamped this thing, Vibaya. We're all over. We're in Mombasa, we're in Kisumu, we're in Bungoma, we're in Nyeri, we're in Nakuru. But each of us is running a technical department, a sales team, NOC, different international connections. Why can't we come together, right? And optimize our costs at the same time as leveraging our strengths? And we sort of spent the rest of that evening talking about this and getting really, really excited about the possibilities and unpacking what this would look like, and brainstorming. And we left that day with an agreement that we're going to go and try and sell this idea to our respective management teams or business partners. At the time, my fellow directors at ISP Kenya and him, Tunjeri, and James Gashui at 190, and they loved it too. So within a very short time, shareholder meeting was convened. Each group of shareholders agreed, yes, let's do this. And come 2005, the transaction took place. And this it started out as a discussion about doing a merger, but it ended up becoming an acquisition. James Gashu is a financial genius. And what he did is he decided that it would be more in the interests of 190 and they could make more money and build something bigger and better if they bought ISP Kenya, preserved their brand as a result of course, being the acquirer, but at the same time, use that opportunity to leverage capital. So they actually quietly re-registered 190 as a public company. Legally, the restriction on the number of shareholders for a private limited company is 60, maximum of 60, according to the laws of Kenya. But you can register as a public limited company, and that lifts that restriction of 60. So they re-registered as a public limited company, but not listed, just public. And then did a private placement. And in their private placement, they engaged the services of Kibi Karezi, this amazing financial genius, an investment guy at the time. And he was given the task of putting together an investment memorandum and raising 1 billion shillings, out of which a chunk was going to be used to buy ISP Kenya. And they then said they would have a war chest, out of which they would maybe do a couple more acquisitions, not just in Kenya, but across the region. Very good strategy. It turned out that private placement of 1 billion was oversubscribed. They got much more than it, and they took it all. And as a result, they were able to actually pay a handsome price for ISP Kenya. And that really hurt. Because at that time is when I started saying, hey guys, do you remember the conversation we had about shares those days? Okay, I said, man, that ship sailed kitambo, dude, sorry, So that hurt when, especially when I remembered how much of my life I'd put into that company. So I decided, okay, that's it. I'm just getting out of this ISP space. I need to go and just recover from my trauma, my PTSD, my, hurt feelings, all of those things. And that's when I set up InHand. And the idea initially, smartphones were just beginning to come onto the scene. There was the Palm PDAs. And I had really had an interest in palm as a product. I had used palm products myself for quite a while, and I'd noticed that there was quite an appetite for digital organizers or personal digital assistants. So I had been bringing in just as a hobby PDAs and selling them to friends. So I decided, let me set up a company and actually set up an official dealership for palm. And, they just introduced a smartphone. And I started selling some of those, and they were like selling like hotcakes. All the MPs wanted one, all the big shots wanted one. So that's what InHand was doing initially, PDAs and smartphones. Then eventually we started getting the opportunity and invitation to set up IP telephony, IP PBXs for corporates. We built cross-country networks, multi-branch IP telephony systems. We got some deals with national security to supply computer forensics equipment and training. So I worked closely with the NSIS on that, training them up on computer forensics, supplying them with mobile kits to do data imaging, as well as a data imaging lab for computer forensics. That's I sort of quit on the on the ISP space. I went into sort of services and whatever. And a few years later, then joined Mobicash, which was a mobile money operator. It's funny how that happened. I was sitting in Nairobi, and I got a call from this old friend of mine from Rwanda, Patrick Ngabonziza, the CEO and founder of Mobicash, and he said, Brian, I'm in Burundi and I'm stuck. I need help. I need somebody to come and hold things kidogo for me for 2 weeks. I have to fly to Switzerland to meet investors. And I've been given like an ultimatum. I must be there. So I've been racking my brain on who has the technical capability and also the management skills to just come and keep things warm while I'm away, and also make sure that the technical implementation that we're doing, interfacing our payment platform with one of the mobile operators here, continues. And I thought about you. So do you mind coming? And I dropped everything I was doing and was on the next flight out to Burundi and spent, instead of 2 weeks, I came back about 2 years later, because what I found when I got there was that he had these mobile money licenses from central banks in 13 different African countries, and he was trying to roll out all of them simultaneously. And he really needed a lot of help. So he assigned me 7 countries, and I was responsible for those 7 in terms of just getting on the ground, finding local partners, local investors, talking to the mobile operators. It was a network agnostic, network neutral platform. So it was essentially a payment platform that would work independent of all operators. So it needed interconnectivity to all operators. So working on those interconnection agreements and so on and so forth. For Botswana, South Africa, Uganda, Kenya, Congo DRC, Gabon, and Burundi and Rwanda as well. And that just swallowed me for 2 years. And I kind of woke up 2 years later and realized that my family was falling apart because I'd barely been home for that whole 2-year period. And I just sort of decided to quit my job there and come back to Kenya, because my marriage was somewhat on the rocks. My kids were almost, in depression, just wondering what's happening with their father. Has he abandoned them? So I quit and, came back to Kenya in 2012. Yeah, 2012.
So speaking about back to your internet infrastructure building, InHand somehow owned shares in Teams.
Somehow.
Apparently owned shares in Teams. Maybe you can speak to that and also share your thoughts. You've moved from copper pairs, twisted copper cable pairs to wireless, and now fiber. And then segue into Malawi and how you got back into the land of your father.
True.
Like,
So the background to that is very interesting. If you recall, was it 2002 when we had the change of regime from Moi to Kibaki? That marked the beginning of a completely new dispensation for the country. And if you recall, one of the things that happened at the time, Anyang Nyong'o was appointed as Minister of Planning. And he initiated this massive national planning exercise to come up with Vision 2020. So that planning exercise, I remember it was very intense. It took place at KICC. It addressed all facets of society. And there was a big ICT piece in there. So quite a lot of us from TESPOC and just people who are also generally interested in, that excitement at that time was just amazing. I cannot begin to describe how good it felt at the time to just be part of this new dispensation. And I remember spending so much time in those planning sessions. And among some of the things that were put into Vision 2020 was the need for Kenya to sort out its international connectivity to the rest of the world. However, obviously now government started implementing Vision 2020 once it was finalized and passed and adopted by prioritizing the key sectors. So agriculture, transport, energy, water, sanitation, health are the ones that really got a lot of initial attention. So it wasn't until a few years later when Bitangendemo was appointed that this thing came up again. And that also is another story on its own, because I remember Bitangendemo was appointed on the 27th of December. Or I remember getting a call. It may not necessarily be the 27th that he was appointed, but I remember getting a call from him on the 27th of December. And he said, he was on the phone and he said, I think it was 2005 or 2006, I'm not sure, or 2000. Anyway, whatever date it was. And I remember him saying, you don't know me, but I've been given your number as one of the key ICT stakeholders. My name is Bitangendemo. I'm the newly appointed permanent secretary in the Ministry of Information. I am calling to find out if you can come for a meeting on the 29th in my office. And I said, yes, I'll come. And I went for the meeting on the 29th and found the room full of the usual suspects, the who's who: Richard Bell, Mushero, Jerry, Tej, Sami Buroshara, quite a few people from academia, the Telcom Kenya people. And basically, he walks into the meeting and he sat there and he said, listen, I'm the newly appointed permanent secretary. I know most of you don't know me. Most of you have maybe even asked, who is he and why was he appointed to that position? What does he know about ICTs and so on and so forth? I am a user and I don't have all the answers. That's why I've called this meeting. I want you guys, because you're the stakeholders, to tell me what you want me to do. What do you want from the government? Come up with 4 priorities. Let's come up with an action plan associated with those, and let me spend my time here working on those issues. And the funny joke that he cracked at the time was, he said, look, from history, we know that the average lifetime of a permanent secretary is 3 months. So you better move quickly so that we can get as much done before I'm changed. That was very funny. He ended up, staying until there was a change of government. But the one of the 4 priorities that was put on the table at the time was a fiber optic cable. But at the time, there was no clear picture of where or the fiber optic cable would terminate. But we said we need to have a fiber optic submarine cable. So the team that worked on that is the one that came up with the idea of building to Fujairah. And then the plan to make it a public-private partnership through an SPV and invite private companies to own shares in it was tabled, and Standard Bank was appointed as the transaction, the guys handling the transaction advisor, so to speak. So they put out an ad in the newspapers, inviting expressions of interest from anybody or any company that would be interested in having shares in the upcoming submarine fiber project. It was in all the daily newspapers. And at the time, I had two companies. I had InHand, which was my trading company, my operating company, and I had another one that I just registered called iQuip. And what I wanted to do with iQuip was I wanted to use iQuip to go into sort of around data centers and where data warehousing and that kind of stuff. So I sent in letters from both companies on a whim, literally. Next thing I know, I'm being called for a meeting and I'm being told each of your companies has been allocated 1.25% shares. You need to pay 1.4 million for each of those allocations, which is 2.8 million within the next 6 months. So I then started running around looking for where I'm going to find this money from. And I was fortunate to find a consortium in Tanzania that was interested. And these guys were able to pull together the money and also get some serious investors involved. Goldman Sachs was the anchor investor, and a few other international organizations were the investors and had agreed to put together about $50 million. One, to be able to pay for the shares in teams, but two, to be able to set up a sort of regional carrier as a business to distribute bandwidth across East Africa. Now, this is 2009. 2009 when these discussions are happening, and the global financial crisis, the mortgage collapse in Europe and the US happened that time. And all of these guys, the stock, you remember what happened with the global financial crisis, everything just sort of plummeted. All these guys pulled out. Goldman Sachs were the first to pull out, and all the other investors pulled out. And the Tanzanians basically came back to me and said, hey, Chief, nikubaya, kuna pesa, there are no investors. So you're by yourself. But we had managed to pay the 10, was it a 10%? There was an amount that had to be paid to secure the shares and then pay the balance. We had managed to pay that. I think it was about 140,000. So we had managed to pay that. So now it was just a matter of the time to get the money together. So I was left holding the baby. So I quickly sort of ran around, and I first went back to Bitange and I told him, dude, this is what's happened, and I don't know what to do. I think I may just have to give these shares back and just call it, a loss. But maybe let me take a couple of weeks to see if I can find anybody else who might be interested. And I started reaching out to Uganda and a few other places. And I found one company that was willing to take up one set of shares, and the other one I returned. And,
wow.
And that was it. I handed it over.
Wow, that's some dealing and high pressure stakes. Yeah. I think you're passionate about building infrastructure, internet infrastructure, Kenya, Uganda, across Africa with MobiCash. But now you're back in Malawi, or you've been back in Malawi. So what prompted that? And just tell us about what you have been doing since you've been back.
Yeah, so 2013, I got the opportunity to go to Uganda. I applied for a position with Oxfam, actually. Oxfam is a humanitarian organization, but they had a position, they were looking for a program manager for something called Internet Now. Internet Now is a very novel approach to improving livelihoods. And what it sought to do was to use internet technologies to improve the livelihoods of people in the north of Uganda, which was a post-conflict region, a region that had suffered from 21 years of civil war and conflict, and was just now recovering. So they needed a program manager to run the program there, and there were a number of different projects under that program, doing different things like, building out internet infrastructure across 5 districts, ICT capacity building, ICT skills, also business process outsourcing as a form of employment and generation of income for individuals. So I went in and I took up that project 2013, and I worked there until end of 2015. That's when the 3-year, I worked myself out of a job basically, because I had to set up a social enterprise and train up a team that could run this and keep it running for as long as it would take. It was a $7 million funded project. So I did that for not $7 million, 7 million euros, because the money was coming out of the Netherlands. It was funded by the postcode lottery, the Dutch postcode lottery. So as I was coming to the tail end of this project, something interesting happened in 2015. Unfortunately, my father passed away. Now, my dad, who, as I mentioned, is from Malawi originally, but moved to Kenya in the late 60s, got married and had us as kids. He retired in 98, which was the year that I got married, and decided to go back to Malawi. So he had been living in Malawi from 98, and 2015, he passed away in June. So I flew from Uganda to his burial in the north of Malawi. And, 2 days later, I was on my way flying back to Uganda. And I'm sitting in the airport in Lilongwe. And I see this Indian guy walking towards me. And I'm like, Suhail is a guy from Tanzania. Suhail, what are you doing here? I was running an ISP in Tanzania, and he was part of the team that I worked with to set up the Tanzania Internet Exchange Point. And he was also part of the team that I worked with to set up the Tanzania ISP Association. And he was actually chairman of the ISP Association in Tanzania for a number of years. I'm like, Suhail, what are you doing in Malawi? And he's like, no, what are you doing here? So we both told our stories. Of course, I told him some unfortunate circumstances. My dad has passed. And he said that he was actually in Malawi on behalf of Simbanet. And I'm like, oh, Simbanet. What's Simbanet doing in Malawi? And he said, yeah, Simbanet won a World Bank tender to build a a terrestrial fiber connection that connects Malawi to the rest of the world through the borders with Tanzania and Zambia. And build a virtual landing point where these cables terminate in country and then distribute that wholesale bandwidth to government and the market. So we are in the construction phase. It's 800 kilometers of fiber. And I come in every month, once a month or once every 2 months, to check on the progress of the contractors, the fiber contractors, and also have meetings with government to update them. So I've just finished those meetings. Sasa, I'm going back to Dar es Salaam. So I mentioned to him, look, I'm coming to the tail end of my contract with Oxfam in Uganda, which should be ending sometime around October this year. So if there's any opportunity within your group, or if you hear of anything around, let me know. And then I forgot about it and went back to Uganda and carried on doing what I was doing. Then in August, I get a call. I pick up the phone and it's Suhail on the other side, and he's like, Brian, you remember you had told me that you might be available sometime. Are you available to go and work in Malawi? We have moved faster than we expected. The cable is almost complete, and we need somebody to go in as general manager to run operations, deliver on the bandwidth contract to government, which is funded by World Bank, but also sell bandwidth to the rest of the market as a wholesale, on a wholesale basis. And yeah, that's what ended up bringing me into Malawi. So I came in end of 2015 as general manager for Simbanet Malawi, which was licensed as a wholesaler, a carrier of carriers essentially. and started selling bandwidth to the marketplace. So within about a year and a half, we were carrying about 70% of all of Malawi's international capacity, supplying the two mobile operators, Airtel and TNM, and all of the ISPs, and a lot of international sort of NGOs that were big capacity or bandwidth uptakers. So I did that for 3 years until end of 2018, and then left. There was you've probably caught it in the media about the shareholder battles within the 190 group. So
Yes.
those ones hit ahead at some point in 2018, and the majority shareholders kicked all of the minority shareholders out of management and put in their own guys. And those guys came in with guns blazing. So anybody who was part of the previous management team just came under fire. And, me, I'm not one to just sort of take things lying down. So tulikosana, nikasema haya, bye-bye. But I still felt that, this place has so much need. It's so far behind. There's so much that can be done. There are so many untapped opportunities. So I teamed up with my younger brother, and we started Converged Technology Networks as an ISP. So back full circle.
Yeah.
To the ISP space. And we started that in January of 2019. So literally 14 years or 15 years after leaving, the ISP world, I find myself back in it again.
Wow, that's quite the journey. I mean, for coming full circle in 15 years, I'm sure some of the white hairs that you probably bear will probably come useful. But even as you reflect on your entrepreneurial journey, your policy journey, what lessons would you be able to share with somebody, entrepreneurs who are looking to set out or to set up shop anywhere in the continent?
Yeah, so of course, doing anything in Africa really needs a lot of grit, right? You have to be able to work hard to overcome challenges. That goes without saying. Entrepreneurship on its own is tough, especially technology entrepreneurship, anywhere in the world. In Africa, you have an equal, you have not equal, but just a strange combination of challenges which just make things a little bit more difficult. And each country has its unique difficulties. So it's about understanding what are the problems, what are the bottlenecks, and figuring out ways to deal with them without being dishonest. But I think the main thing that I would be able to say to any entrepreneur is, no matter what line of business, no matter what kind of business you're involved in or doing, always try to put aside some time to give back. Put aside some time to serve that market, to serve that community that you're trying to do your business in. I really strongly believe in, the concept of paying it forward, doing a good deed. I believe strongly in the principle of sowing and reaping. And, if you can be able to sow good seeds or seeds of goodwill on a voluntary basis through maybe trying to help government solve certain problems in your market, or trying to help a regulator or a department or a school or a hospital or whatever it might be, solve a problem without you making money from it, you reap it in one way or another. So for me, I would say that it's more about impact than it is about profit. That's my motivator. And I know this wouldn't work for everybody, but to me, I would say, if I can lay my head to rest knowing that I've had an impact in this world in one way or another, wherever I am or wherever I find myself, I will know that I've done my part. So yeah, I think my advice is a bit lopsided, but yeah, it is what it is.
Wow, and I think there's something that you mentioned, which is very key, that impact over profits. Some people put it purpose over profits. And at the moment, if you look at the continent, we're experiencing a lot of easy capital availability for startups. In the last 2 years, if the media is anything to go by, we are seeing a lot of startups in the technology space raising record-breaking rounds at the seed level or even at other series. I don't know whether that's a good thing or a bad thing, where we have a lot of capital around, and what does that mean for the future of technology in Africa in general? You mentioned earlier on that you also had investors or financiers coming in to put in money. I bet it wasn't as easy as it is now. Do you think that's a good thing, or what's your take on that?
No, I think it's incredible. I think actually Africa has come a long way. The tech industry across Africa has come a long way in terms of being able to position itself and become attractive as a destination for capital. However, the interesting thing, if you really take a microscope and look closely, you will see that the bulk of those investments are going into 5 countries. They're going into Nigeria, they're going into South Africa, they're going into Kenya, and they're going into Egypt. But they're all branded as Africa. So the rest of Africa is kind of losing out or getting a disservice because they're kind of ranked or positioned on the same lines as those. But having said that, let me come back to your initial point, right? And yes, it's really good, you know, to see the levels of investment that have begun to come into tech businesses on this continent. However, obviously, any investment or any investor is looking for a return, right? And they want 10x return, minimum. If you look carefully at most of the deal structure, if you know we were able to blow past all the NDAs and look into the shareholder agreements or the basis for negotiation behind many of the investments that have come in, or even just look at the pitches that the entrepreneurs made to be able to get those funds, you will see that mostly it's being driven by the opportunity or the promise of a 10x return. 10 times of the investment should return to that investor within at least 10 years. Now, what that does is it puts a huge amount of pressure on the entrepreneur. It puts a massive amount of pressure on the company to turn a profit, to scale, to go bigger. You then find this situation, which I find extremely disingenuous or counterintuitive, where you have entrepreneurs who just are completely full-time fundraising. So it's one fund after another, after another, and they're not really building. They spend so much time fundraising, they're not really building. And you know, I think we're going to begin to see a lot of, I don't know if you may call it implosions or explosions of tech companies that took their eye off the ball of building the business to be able to deliver the value and focused more on storytelling and hype to get the next fund or to get the next round. And you know, of course, maybe on the other side of the equation, overexcited investors who don't necessarily do enough due diligence to see, is there really depth in this venture? Are these guys really able to deliver on the promise? Are they really able to build the traction? So there's a lot of quick transactions that are happening. I don't know if that's a really good thing for the industry. When the implosions start happening, obviously there's going to be blowback, and there's going to be a sort of, you know, a few steps back taken by the whole of the investment community when they see, okay, it looks like all that glitters is not gold as far as Africa Tech is concerned. Let's sort of, you know, slow things down a little bit. Now, what happens is with this kind of scenario, you find a lot of genuine businesses and companies that are interested in building properly getting affected, right? I remember was it last week or the week before, a friend in Kenya asked a question about the valuation, contrasting the valuation of Cellulant with the valuation of Flutterwave, and saying, Flutterwave is already a unicorn. Why is Cellulant not a unicorn? But if you look at it in strict terms, in terms of number of customers, number of markets, number of partnership agreements, number of banks, number of transactions, transaction volume, revenues, Cellulant is up here compared to the other one. But valuation-wise, at $3.8 billion, with Cellulant still below, I think $600,000. The question was being raised: why is that? What is whatever? And there was a very interesting series of comments and discussions that ensued on that particular post on LinkedIn by Mbugua J here. I think it was, not Mbugua J, it was Karim Abdul. That's my perspective. And I would say there is a sort of unhealthy side to this hype that's been going on. It's only a matter of time before the implosions start happening. And how are those going to mess up the opportunity for solid, genuine ventures that are being built the right way, and for founders that have integrity and are not just going to say anything to please, anything that pleases the VC community, in order to just close on big money, right?
I think that raises another component. I think other than the implosion that you speak of that is coming, there is also the issue of big tech companies like Microsoft, AWS coming into the space. And what you're finding out is that many of these small startups that had what they would have considered as innovation and as their unique value proposition to the market, most of these giants come in and offer that maybe for nearly zero. And that is really impacting the future viability of some of these businesses. Yes, you can have a very hot idea right now that is cutting edge and innovative, that according to all science shows that this is your killer app as a startup. But then 8 months down the line, whatever you are trying to sell out to the market is available for free from Microsoft or from Amazon. Other than in the area of innovation, there's also the issue of talent. I have personally been affected up to last week, losing resources to these giants, Microsoft with their ADC in Nairobi, Amazon recruiting regionally, poaching a lot of talent, paying them significant amounts of remunerations that these startups cannot afford. What is your take on that, where we have these startups growing talent and this talent being taken by the giants, these giants coming in with innovations or with products that are priced at a point where the small innovation companies are unable to compete at because of lack of scale?
I have some very contrary views on this issue, to be completely honest, Tom.
Yes.
And my views stem really from a very critical, appreciation of our governments. And when I say our governments, I'm talking about Africa in general, right? If you listen closely to the rhetoric that comes from most of the political leaders in our countries, they talk about, we are open for business. Africa is open for business. Kenya is open for business. Malawi is open for business. Uganda is open for business, right? And they express that openness by allowing anybody and everybody to come in, right? Now, what they don't do is they don't really think carefully about, as a country, what's our real strategy? Where do we want to be in 20 years, right? Do we want to be a consumer or a producer? Do we want to be, a warehouse, or do we want to be a factory, right? And because of this lack of strategic thinking, they then end up creating policies that work to the disadvantage of their own indigenous businesses. If you look carefully at the countries where most of these big companies are coming from, and you look at the policy environments and the policy frameworks that drive those nations, you will see a very, 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 very deliberate focus and strategy on promoting their own enterprises outside of their markets, right? Mm-hmm. A couple of weeks ago, I was on a call, actually a series of meetings with one of the big developing countries. Basically, it was a trade mission for promoting their tech companies to Africa. So on the call, we had two sides, or on the 3 days of meetings, we had two sides. Companies from that country that had been earmarked by this government agency, and then companies from Africa. And we had companies there. Malawi, we were the only company. But from Kenya, there were about 10 companies. There, from South Africa, there were about 10. There were some from Nigeria. There were some from a few other countries. And essentially, this whole thing was organized by a government agency to promote their own technology companies to these target companies in Africa, to these target markets in Africa. And one of the things they said is, look, we are able to provide grants of up to $1.5 million US for feasibility studies that would help you guys in Africa take advantage of technology and services from our countries. But the technology and services from our countries need to be able to demonstrate a value of $50 million plus over the next 10 years. We're interested in ensuring employment and opportunities for our citizens. And they're not ashamed to say that, because that's their job, right? Yeah. Have you ever seen an African country that has something like that?
None that I'm aware of.
You've seen the ease with which some of these big companies, or not even necessarily big companies, but the ease with which some of the foreign players are able to come and set up shop in our markets. You go and try and set up a company in China. You go and try and set up a company in Korea. You go and try and set up a company in Switzerland. You go and try and apply for a banking license in the UK to offer payments, or in the US, and you see what you're going to see. But here, these guys on our side, they can walk in and do it anyhow, anytime, and they'll be welcomed with open arms. In fact, they'll even be given tax incentives. Which you are not accessible. You don't have access to any of those as a local. So I think at a policy level, our governments have got it all wrong. They need to wake up and smell the coffee. They need to realize we need to think about where we want to be in 10, 20, 30 years time, where we want our children to be, because by that time, some of us tutakuwa tumepita kitambo, but where will our kids be? Will probably be a warehouse instead of a factory, where people can come and store their stuff and come and take it as they please, right? Those are my slightly contrary views. Now, with regards to the brain drain that's happening, it's interesting, and it's a bit scary, to be completely honest. And I can only imagine how painful it is when you've really worked to train up somebody, build up their skills and capacity, and you have them as part of your sort of growth trajectory and plan. Then all of a sudden they're not there.
Yeah.
And you're scratching your head and you're wondering, okay, how am I going to do this? How am I going to build? Where am I going to find this person? I'm back to the drawing board. There's no help for me. There's no support. It's very scary as a business owner, as a founder, to encounter such a situation. And yes, for sure, there's no way you can compete with the big platforms in terms of just pay packages and the likes. I remember when I was being headhunted by Google for their position in Africa, is when I first came across the concept of golden handcuffs. Some of these jobs, they come with handcuffs, they lock you completely. But if they are gold, they give you such incredible benefits and a pay package that they know once we get this person in, hakuna mali wanaenda for at least 5 years, maybe even 10. We own them, basically. And they've perfected these techniques. In a way, it's really challenging. I don't think there's really an easy answer or a solution, because the only alternative is for us to be able to offer competitive packages, right? But how do you do that when you're just building up? You're building your company or your venture, right? How do you compete with the salary that these guys are offering? Unless you can be able now to start being able to be more competitive by offering shares as an incentive, being able to, figure out if you can tap into any kind of grants. Can the government make available certain types of tech incentive grants, where, companies can be able to get additional support to be able to retain skills for their growth? It is a big issue, and one of concern. And I don't think there's any easy answer to it. It's all just happening now, and it's all hitting everybody now. Heads are still reeling. I don't think, I definitely for one don't have any clue.
True. Talking of head spinning, mine is still spinning after losing a very good engineer to Microsoft last week. So I know we can spend, yeah, true. We can spend a lot of time because I know there is a lot that we can talk about the past, but I'd like you to peer into your crystal ball and just give us a glimpse of what the future looks like 10 years from now. What is the internet in Africa gonna look like, considering you are now back in the trenches? One thing I like about you is that you I see you configuring equipment. I see you on top of masts. I see you getting your hands dirty, and that's very encouraging for especially us. So what does the future look like 10 years from now?
10 years is a long time, to be completely honest with you.
5 years.
No, let's keep it at 10 years. It's good, I think, to try and throw the crystal ball that far forward. Personally, I don't think we'll have anything like this internet that we know now. It'll look completely, it'll be different. Given geopolitics and the way things are going and the kind of signals that people have been making recently, China saying they'll build their own network, Russia already saying they have theirs, the West saying, I saw a report the other day from the US military, which described their view of the internet. It was scary, to see them talking about this blue part is the one that the parts of the internet that we control. And then this gray part is the parts of the internet that are under the control of other nations with which we have a liaison. And then this other red part, that one is parts of the internet that are controlled by enemies. It was my first time to really see the internet cast that way. But it is true that the internet has become the new frontier for global conflicts. So this internet that we know today, I don't think it will exist in 10 years in the future. It will probably have been superseded by a conglomeration of different types of networks that are under different types of control. You might even have just a different African thing, that us Miros might just wake up and smell the coffee and decide, let us make United States of Africa, and do our own thing, and to wherever with those guys. I don't know. Anything can happen. 10 years is a short time, but it's also a long time as far as technology is concerned. Or you never know. We might have just somebody might hit the reset button and sort of just take us back a few steps in one way or another. if the global escalation of the conflict we are seeing right now heads in the direction that some prophets of doom are predicting. You never know. Some of these movies that we watch where you have, post-apocalyptic situations where people are returned to cavemen because there was a fallout that eliminated 88% of humanity and killed all technology, or some kind of EMP that froze, that fried all electronics or whatever. I don't know. I watch too many movies. I'm the wrong person for you to ask this question.
Thank you for your very honest answer. And actually, had you given a very precise answer, I would have been a little bit worried because it is very difficult to predict the future, especially with the way technology is advancing. So, asante sana.
It's too fast.
It's too fast. Too fast. Now, let's shift away from a lot of tech and now move into life. Josiah.
So in closing, I think we could spend 5 hours talking about your illustrious career. Just
true.
A couple of questions as we close. As you close this, essentially sharing your life. What will you tell your 20-year-old self, given what you know now, in terms of what you'll do, not do, what are your regrets? Just reflect. Hindsight is 2020, but what will you go back in past to change?
The advice I would give my 20-year-old self is buy and hold. And take the shares. The reason why I say that, I remember my dad did something. There was a point at which Postbank, Kenya, went to listed on the Nairobi Stock Exchange, and my dad bought some shares for my brother and myself, and he very kind of proudly came and showed us our little sort of, they were not really share certificates, there were some kind of little books that had the list of shares and things like that. This was back in the 80s, if I'm not wrong, and we didn't think much of it. Then in the 90s, I remember at some point I was broke. I found this thing somewhere and I sold those shares, those Postbank shares. I got, I think, 5,000 shillings or something like that, or maybe 15, I'm not sure. They had appreciated, but not that much. Things were still thick. But today, those shares would be probably worth a few million today. So I think, the advice I would give to my 20-year-old self is learn as much as you can about finance and global finance, and just be smart about it.
Wow. Thank you so much for sharing all of this. And I'm sure we could go on for another 2 hours, 5 hours, but I think we should just have to cut it short. So thank you very much, Brian.
Cheers.
And see you in Nairobi next time when you're here.
Thank you very much.
Yeah,
Brian.
I hope to come soon. Yeah, cheers, guys. Thanks a lot for the opportunity.